Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something pretty big, actually. It kind of has this massive influence on how we do things, how we succeed. I'm talking about, on a personal level, but also how we work together in teams, even whole companies and organizations. We're talking about mindset culture. And to help us really get a grip on this, we're going to be exploring Mary C. Murphy's book, Cultures of Growth. The full title's a mouthful. It's Cultures of Growth: How the New Science of Mindset Can Transform Individuals, Teams, and Organizations.
Yeah, Cultures of Growth. It's a really fascinating book. And what Murphy does so well is she really brings to light these subtle, almost invisible forces that are always there shaping, like how we interact every day, whether it's, trying to get that promotion at work or trying to get a project going with your colleagues or even just feeling comfortable enough to actually speak up in a meeting. It's pretty amazing how much these underlying mindsets matter.
Totally. And I know you've given us some seriously interesting material to work with for this deep dive. Stuff on host speaker would insert general areas based on a hypothetical listener's sources. And we're going to kind of use, the ideas of fixed versus growth mindsets. These are the things Murphy calls cultures of genius and cultures of growth as a way to really understand what's going on beneath the surface, in all these different situations.
Yeah, I think when you can step back and look at the bigger picture, really grasping those differences, the culture differences, gives you a really valuable way to not just see the challenges that you're facing, but also start to think about ways to create, more productive and rewarding environments, both for yourself and the people you work with.
I mean, think about it, right? Have you ever been in a situation, let's say at work, maybe even just a group project or something, where you had an idea, but you hesitated to share it? Like you were kind of worried about how people would react? Or maybe you've seen a team where when somebody makes a mistake, it's all blame and negativity instead of okay, what can we learn from this? These kind of experiences often point to a depper mindset culture at play.
And this brings us to, I think, a really key question for all of us. How do these cultural norms, these often unspoken things, how do they actually end up shaping how we act, how we behave, whether we're willing to collaborate, really work together, our ability to come up with new ideas and solutions, even the way we think about risk, taking chances, and how we bounce back when things don't go our way. That's what we're going to dig into, try to unpack in this deep dive. Hopefully it'll give you a new way to see your own experiences and the way things work within the groups you're part of.
All right, so let's jump right in and start by defining these two different kinds of cultures that Murphy talks about. First up, there's what she calls the culture of genius. Can you break down the main idea behind that for us?
Sure. So at the core of a culture of genius, there's this really strong belief that that your abilities, your talents are basically fixed. It's like saying you either got it or you don't. And your intelligence, skills, they're just, they're kind of set in stone. They don't really change much.
And so, practically speaking, what happens when that kind of belief system is at work, in a team or an organization?
Well, with this fixed mindset, it makes sense that people would shy away from tough challenges, because if you take on something hard and you don't succeed, well, it might make you look like you just don't have that natural ability. And when things go wrong, when there are setbacks, they're not seen as opportunities to learn. They're seen as proof that you just, you don't have what it takes. And this makes it a lot easier for people to just give up when the going gets tough.
Yeah, I remember how Murphy uses that example of the classic Monday morning team meeting, right? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, definitely. Imagine this, right? You've got a new person joining the team, and they walk into this Monday morning meeting, and the vibe is just, it's thick with competition.
Yeah.
Everybody's kind of trying to one up each other. People are name dropping their fancy degrees, bragging about their big wins from the previous week, trying to impress everyone. And then when somebody brings up a project that's behind schedule, the whole conversation just turns into this blame game. Lots of finger pointing, but zero focus on actually trying to figure out how to fix the problem. So this new team member, they have an idea, something that could potentially help, but they're hesitant to speak up. They're afraid of being judged if it's not perfect. And by the end of the meeting, they're just left feeling like, maybe I'm not good enough for this. And they're way less likely to share their ideas next time. What's really key here is that it becomes all about focusing on individual performance and avoiding blame, instead of actually working together to solve problems as a team.
Ugh, it sounds super stressful, right? Like that kind of environment where everyone's walking on eggshells. And Murphy also talks about some pretty big name leaders who seem to really embody this genius mentality. And sometimes the results were really bad.
Yeah, what's really interesting is that, this need to always look like a genius, to maintain that image, it can actually end up masking weaknesses and even lead to like straight up unethical behavior. Take Elizabeth Holmes with Theranos, for example.
Yeah.
She built this whole persona of being this brilliant visionary, but it turned out to be based on like completely false claims.
Hmm.
Same with Arif Naki from Abraj, projecting this image of, financial genius while the reality was like super different. These examples show how risky it is to prioritize just the appearance of brilliance, of being a genius, over actually growing, learning, and acting ethically.
It's like the pressure to live up to this image of genius can make people do some really messed up stuff. And it's not just in the business world either, is it? This fixed mindset can seep into education too.
You're absolutely right. When Murphy did research in teacher training programs, she found that some teachers would label students who are having a tough time as just having a fixed mindset, like it's some kind of, permanent label, something they're stuck with. Some even said they didn't think it was their job to help students develop a growth mindset. And that's ironic, isn't it? Because that kind of thinking, that labeling, is a fixed mindset in itself, right?
Yeah.
It limits the teacher's own approach and really impacts the student's chances of succeeding. The really important thing to remember is that those labels can become self-fulfilling prophecies. They hurt the student's learning and hold the teacher back too.
So it's like a double whammy. It hurts both the student and the teacher. All right, now let's flip it around. Let's talk about the culture of growth. What's the basic idea that defines this kind of culture?
So the foundation of a culture of growth is the belief that abilities, intelligence, they're not fixed. They can be developed over time. So you see talents and skills as something you can cultivate, you can improve with, hard work, smart strategies, and really importantly, with help and support from other people.
So how does this change in belief, how does it play out in how people actually behave and interact with each other?
Well, it leads to a completely different way of dealing with challenges and setbacks, right? People with a growth mindset, they actually tend to embrace tough tasks. They see them as like valuable chances to learn new things and get better. Mistakes aren't failures, they're just feedback to help you do better next time. And setbacks, they don't lead to giving up, they just make people more determined to figure things out, try new things until they succeed. The takeaway here is that it's not about just showing off what you're already good at. It's about constantly developing new skills.
So let's rewind back to that Monday morning meeting, but this time let's imagine it's happening in a culture of growth. Paint us a picture of what that would look like.
Okay, so now you've got that same new team member walking into the Monday meeting. But this time, they're warmly welcomed. People acknowledge that they have something to contribute, that their ideas are valuable. And when people give updates on projects, they don't just talk about the wins. They also share the struggles they're having, and they invite the whole team to help brainstorm solutions together. When the missed deadline comes up, it's not about finding someone to blame. The focus is on figuring out what went wrong and how to avoid it next time. And blame is just, it's not even part of the conversation. The big difference is that in this kind of culture, it's about learning together, solving problems together, not about pointing fingers and judging each other.
It sounds so much healthier, right? Like
Check.
you can actually breathe in that meeting. And Murphy talks about Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. He's a really great example of a leader who actively tried to create this kind of culture of growth within, a massive organization.
Oh yeah. When Nadella took over Microsoft, he made a conscious effort to shift the whole company culture towards a growth mindset. It was a deliberate choice. He saw how important innovation and creativity were for Microsoft to stay successful. And he specifically asked, how can embracing a growth mindset help us achieve that? The lesson there is that changing a culture, especially in a big company, takes a real commitment from leadership and a clear vision of what that new mindset looks like.
So we've got these two very different cultures, right? Now let's dig deeper into their impact. How does the overall mindset of a company actually affect the individuals working there?
That mindset of the place we work in, it has a huge impact. And a lot of the time, it's subconscious. It starts to shape not only how we see our own abilities, but also how we value what other people can do, their potential. And often, we unconsciously start to adopt the company's mindset as our own. It's kind of a self-fulfilling thing. What's really important to understand is that a really strong culture of genius can actually overpower someone's natural tendency towards a growth mindset. Imagine someone who's naturally curious, eager to learn, to grow. Well, if they're in a company where everything's about fixed abilities and never making mistakes, they might start to become risk-averse, more focused on just maintaining a certain image. It's like the environment wins over individual personality.
That's kind of scary that even someone who naturally leans towards growth can be held back by the culture. What are some of the concrete differences, the outcomes we see in these different cultures?
Research consistently shows that cultures of genius tend to have lower levels of trust between employees and less commitment to the company. And people are much more likely to want to leave. It makes sense, right? If you don't feel trusted or valued, why would you want to stay? On the other hand, cultures of growth tend to have much more positive and effective company cultures overall. Their employees are more satisfied and they perform better. The bottom line is that the mindset of your company has a direct effect on whether people are engaged and want to stick around.
That totally makes sense. If you feel like your company values your potential and they see mistakes as part of learning, of course you're going to be more invested in the company's success. Murphy also talks about how these cultures can affect who even gets a fair shot, especially when we talk about diversity.
Yeah, this is really important. In cultures of genius, you often see this thing called prototype matching, where unconsciously, certain industries or fields develop this idea of what the ideal genius looks like.
Hmm.
And then they tend to favor people who fit that mold. Like in STEM fields, historically, that prototype has often been, a certain demographic, which can shut out super talented people from other backgrounds. But in growth cultures, while skills and competence are still important, they place a higher value on someone's motivation, their potential to grow and learn, their dedication. These are qualities that anyone can have, regardless of their background. So the big point is that focusing on growth potential can actually lead to recognizing talent in a much more inclusive way.
So it's not just about what you see as like innate talent, which can be biased without us even realizing it. It's about valuing potential and a commitment to learning. Now, how does this whole mindset system, how does it get reinforced and passed down within a company over time?
Murphy talks about this thing she calls the organizational mindset culture cycle. It starts with how we perceive the values of a company, both what they say and what they do. Based on that, we tend to show off either fixed or growth-minded traits. This can happen right from the start, like in job interviews or when we're trying to get on certain teams. Then, once we're in the company, we keep showing off the traits that seem to be valued so we can get rewards, like good performance reviews and promotions. Over time, as we keep doing this and get rewarded for it, we start to internalize those traits. We actually believe that this is who we are and how we should act. And this leads us to fully embrace the company's mindset, which, keeps the whole cycle going. So it's like this self-sustaining system driven by what we think the company values and how they reward people.
A very powerful cycle, for good or bad. Let's zoom in on a specific area of how companies work, which is collaboration, right? Working together in teams. How do these two different mindsets affect that?
Cultures of growth are way better at creating real, productive collaboration. In cultures of genius, even without formal systems like stack ranking, which can be really damaging, you still tend to get internal competition. When people believe there's only so much genius to go around, they become focused on showing off their own talents and achievements. They hide their weaknesses, avoid risks, and sometimes even do things that are unethical, like hoarding important information. Why? Because they think they need to protect their position. The big lesson here is that believing in fixed abilities just undermines trust and open communication, which are essential for real teamwork.
That makes perfect sense. Internal competition just sounds so counterproductive, like shooting yourself in the foot. You mentioned stack ranking. Murphy gives some pretty rough examples of how that can play out.
Oh, yeah. Like at Indiana University, they had this merit race system where faculty were ranked against each other and the rankings were made public. It created this, atmosphere of dread and totally discouraged collaboration. Think about it. Why would you help a colleague if their success means you might get a lower ranking and less money? Another example is WeWork, where they had these brutal genocides where something like the bottom 20% of performers were just fired, and it was public. It created a culture of fear and led to tons of people quitting. It was especially frustrating for people with a growth mindset because they felt like the company didn't care about their effort or development. The big takeaway is that systems that force people to compete directly with each other can really damage collaboration and kill morale.
And that high turnover rate, all those people quitting, that costs companies a lot of money, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Studies from places like the Center for American Progress show that replacing an employee can cost a company a big chunk of their salary. We're talking tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the job. And Gallup estimates that millennials alone leaving their jobs cost the U.S. economy billions of dollars every year. And millennials really care about working for companies with values that align with their own, which is often missing in those hyper-competitive cultures of genius. So not having a collaborative culture where people feel supported and can grow, it has a real financial impact.
So it's not just about happy employees, it hits the bottom line too. But there are companies out there trying to build more collaborative cultures, right? What are they doing?
Yeah, and Murphy talks about some great examples. Atlassian, for instance, they focus a lot on career development, right? From when you start working there. They do 90-day onboarding plans and career development plans. And managers do these stay interviews with their team members to figure out their goals. They even share stories internally about how people have grown within the company, which shows that learning and getting better is a constant process that involves, facing challenges and overcoming them. And all this focus on development and support has led to high employee satisfaction and a strong company valuation. The point is that investing in your employees' growth and understanding what they want can really boost collaboration and help the whole company succeed.
Yeah, that proactive approach, like actually caring about your employees' needs before they're thinking of leaving, that seems really key. What about in fields that are known for being super competitive, like scientific research? Can you have a culture of growth there?
Oh, for sure. Jennifer Doudna, she's a leader in CRISPR research, and her lab is known for being very collaborative and having this strong team spirit. She encourages her team to take on big, challenging projects, and she even created a CRISPR conference where researchers share their unpublished data. This focus on support and growth has made her lab very successful and innovative. So even in a super competitive field, prioritizing collaboration and open communication can lead to faster progress.
It's not always about formal programs or policies, is it? Sometimes it seems like it comes down to the company's core values.
You got it. Patagonia, from the beginning, has built their company culture around valuing ensemble players, people who put the team's success first, ahead of individual recognition. They don't tolerate people who try to grab the spotlight at the expense of the team. Their founder, Yvonne Chouinard, has said they don't want stars who expect special treatment. This commitment to collaboration, along with their ethics and sustainability focus, is at the heart of who Patagonia is, and it's a big reason they're so successful. The takeaway is that deep-seated values that prioritize working together can really shape the whole company.
It's funny, sometimes having a very fixed mindset about collaboration can actually be a really good thing. And it seems like the mindset of the founders, those early leaders, can have a huge impact on the company's culture. Totally. Research actually shows a connection between what founders believe about effort and ability and the kind of culture that develops in their companies. Founders who have a growth mindset, those who believe that working hard leads to greater ability, they tend to create more collaborative and supportive environments. And, maybe surprisingly, companies with growth-minded founders are also more likely to be successful at raising money. So the founder's mindset can affect the whole company culture and even its ability to attract resources.
So it's not like collaboration comes at the expense of success. It can actually drive success, both for individuals and the whole company. Now, Murphy also talks about something called Q's audits. Can you explain what those are and why they're important? Yeah, Q's audits are really helpful when you're working with affinity groups, those groups representing people from underrepresented backgrounds. These folks are super tuned to the subtle cues in the environment that tell them whether a company actually values things like respect, inclusion, and collaboration, or if it's just lip service. Asking specific questions about their experiences with collaboration can reveal a lot about how things really work, which might be different from what the company says they value. So paying attention to the experiences of underrepresented groups can give you a much more accurate picture of the true company culture.
It's about looking beyond the surface at people's real day-to-day experiences. Now, let's say a company realizes they're stuck in a more competitive, less collaborative model. Can they actually change that?
Definitely. Microsoft is a great example. They completely got rid of their stack ranking system, which was super controversial, after realizing how much it was hurting collaboration and morale. Patagonia went even further and got rid of individual performance ratings altogether. They shifted to this more holistic approach. They call it regenerative HR, inspired by sustainable farming, where the focus is on nurturing employees' potential over time. They even use things like department collaboration network diagrams to see how much different teams are actually working together. So they're making real changes to their systems and their whole philosophy to build a truly collaborative culture.
It's a big shift, right? Going from a winner-take-all mentality to a more holistic view, where the whole organization's health and interconnectedness are valued. Okay, let's move on to innovation and creativity. How do these things get affected by mindset culture?
Well, like we talked about, collaboration is a huge driver of innovation. So cultures of growth, by their very nature, they're already set up to be more innovative. Now, it's not that cultures of genius can't innovate. It's just that they often have to fight against their own fixed-minded norms and all that internal competition. It can make the whole process harder, slower, and limit what they can actually achieve. It's like trying to fly a plane into a strong headwind. You might get there eventually, but it'll take a lot more effort and fuel.
Hmm.
The point is, a collaborative environment with a growth mindset is a much better breeding ground for innovation.
Can you give us some examples of companies that have used a growth mindset to boost innovation?
Absolutely. Shell, with their Goal Zero safety initiative, is a great example. Their leadership admitted that they had some fixed mindsets around safety, and they knew that to reach their goal of zero incidents, they needed to create a culture of learning where people felt comfortable reporting near misses. They were committed to constant improvement at all levels. Atlassian does these Ship It days, where employees from any department can get together and work on projects they're passionate about outside their regular jobs. It's a fantastic way to encourage collaboration and spark new ideas. And then there's the classic example of 3M and their 15% time, where employees could spend 15% of their time on personal projects. This led to the invention of Post-it notes, by the way. So by giving people dedicated time and space to explore and connect with others, companies can unlock a lot of creative potential.
Those are some really cool examples. And it's not just about creating the opportunities, right? It's about having leadership that encourages learning and improvement. What's one of the key elements that allows innovation to flourish?
Psychological safety is huge. If people are scared to make mistakes, to share new ideas, to challenge the way things are done, it just shuts down learning and creativity. Cultures of genius, where everyone's worried about being judged and looking perfect, they often put people in this state of fear. It makes it almost impossible to do your best work and take the risks you need to for real innovation. Growth cultures, though, they prioritize creating psychological safety where everyone feels valued and respected. They feel like they can experiment and learn without being punished for it. So psychological safety is like the foundation you need to build a culture of innovation.
You talked about Jacqueline Novogratz and her work in Africa earlier. How does her experience illustrate the importance of psychological safety?
Novogratz noticed that in programs designed to support entrepreneurs in Africa, the lack of psychological safety was a big obstacle. Entrepreneurs had learned to tell funders and supporters what they thought those people wanted to hear, instead of being honest about their needs, challenges, and maybe even unconventional ideas. They were afraid to be judged or rejected. It showed that real progress in innovation starts with leaders who are willing to listen deeply, to be open to different perspectives, and to learn. That's the foundation of Acumen, the organization she founded. Similarly, the leadership at Shell knew that for their safety culture to really change, they needed to get buy-in from everyone in the company and encourage them to be open and honest. So being a good listener and creating a space where people feel safe to speak up, that's how you build trust and unlock true innovation.
So it's about intentionally making people feel safe enough to speak their minds, to try new things, to see failures as learning experiences. And that applies both to creating a strong safety culture and a culture of innovation. Now let's talk about risk-taking and resilience. How do these things show up in genius versus growth cultures?
In growth cultures, taking risks is seen as a normal and important part of growing and innovating. But they're smart about it, they plan carefully, analyze data, and have backup plans. When things don't go as planned, which happens, the focus is on figuring out what happened and learning from it, not on blaming people. We saw this with Shell and their new approach to safety incidents. They shifted away from punishment and towards understanding the root causes and making improvements. So in a growth culture, taking risks is about learning.
And data seems to be a big part of this, right? Using data to make decisions about risks.
Definitely. Teams and organizations with a growth mindset, they use data to figure out if a risk is worth taking. They also track their progress with data to see if their decisions are working. This data-driven approach makes the whole process of change and innovation less scary because you have objective feedback and can adjust course as you go. Louis Wool, he did some amazing work transforming a school district by addressing inequalities using data. Even at Twitter, where the legal team was initially more risk-averse, their efforts to build a growth mindset involved using more data and understanding the downsides of being too afraid of risk. So using data can make taking risks feel less dangerous and helps create a more adaptive culture.
It's about being willing to look at the numbers, to see what the evidence tells you. That seems like a big difference between these two cultures. And it's not just about external data, right? It's also about internal reflection, learning from your own experiences.
Right. The Twitter team realized that to build a culture of growth, they needed good internal documentation and easy ways for everyone to learn. They wanted to empower everyone with the knowledge to take risks and learn from both successes and failures. It was the opposite of that sink or swim mentality, which is a big sign of a genius culture.
Uh-huh.
So investing in knowledge sharing and learning resources is key for a resilient and growth-oriented organization.
Earlier, you mentioned a time when you accidentally created a culture of genius in your own lab. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I was thinking about a situation where a student in my lab did something that was ethically wrong. They were under a lot of pressure to get specific research results, and I realized that maybe my own focus on those results had created a culture where students felt like they had to cut corners to meet expectations. It was a wake-up call that just having good intentions as a leader isn't enough. You have to actively shape the culture to emphasize learning, open communication, and ethical behavior, especially in a competitive field like academic research. I learned that you have to constantly check in on the culture of your team or organization and make sure it matches your values. You have to work to build and maintain an inclusive and growth-oriented environment. It's not something that just happens on its own.
It's a good reminder that we're always creating and shaping the culture around us, whether we realize it or not. Now let's talk about ethics and integrity. How do these fare in genius versus growth cultures?
Unfortunately, things like cheating, hoarding information, sabotaging others, even outright fraud are more likely to happen in cultures of genius. Those things can happen anywhere, but growth-minded organizations are more likely to reflect on ethical issues, take responsibility, and fix problems. They're also more proactive about setting clear ethical guidelines. The pressure to look brilliant in a genius culture can actually push people towards unethical behavior.
You mentioned Laura Braden from GFI. How does she represent this difference?
Braden talked about how strongly GFI sticks to its core values, which includes sharing knowledge openly and making decisions based on evidence and logic. These values guide everything they do and ensure that ethical considerations are always front and center. Having clear, strong values is essential for a truly ethical culture.
So in a growth culture, it's not just about following the rules, it's about ethics being tied to the whole idea of learning and getting better.
Exactly. Doing unethical things, like cheating or manipulating the system, goes against the very purpose of learning and growth. In cultures of genius, where it's all about being a star performer, there's more temptation to do shady things to stay on top. And it's often not a conscious decision by the leaders. They might not even realize the pressure they're creating.
Can companies do things to encourage ethical behavior through their metrics and compensation, like how they measure success and reward people?
Definitely. One thing they can do is measure and reward ethical behaviors directly, instead of just focusing on things like speed or volume. Like a call center shifted from measuring how fast calls were handled to how many customer accounts were saved. That led to a big improvement in the quality of customer interactions. It's also super important to make sure that compensation systems reward the values the company wants to encourage. Companies need to recognize that long-term growth through learning and ethical behavior is more valuable than just chasing short-term profits.
What about in really competitive fields like research, where there's so much pressure to publish and advance your career? How can we promote ethical behavior there?
One way is to reward collaboration and sharing instead of the lone genius mentality. That can help prevent things like hoarding data or cutting corners to get published. The open science movement is a good example of a push towards more collaborative and ethical research practices.
It's interesting how even the way professionals are trained, like in medicine, can affect their ethical choices later on.
Yeah, the competition in medical school can create a focus on individual success that might lead to less ethical decisions later in their careers. But Dr. Jennifer Danick's experience was different. She went to a medical school that had a culture of growth, where students were supported, encouraged to talk about their mistakes, and focused on solving problems together. It shows that the early stages of professional training can have a big impact on future ethics.
We also see how a company responds to failures or crises can tell us a lot about their mindset and commitment to ethics.
The way Johnson & Johnson handled the Tylenol tampering crisis, compared to how Perrier dealt with the benzene contamination, are great examples. Johnson & Johnson was immediate, transparent, and focused on consumer safety. They took responsibility and learned from the crisis, which actually built trust in the long run. Perrier, on the other hand, initially denied the problem and did a limited recall. They were more worried about protecting their brand than doing the right thing. The lesson is that when a company shows they prioritize learning and ethical behavior, even during a crisis, people trust them more.
Okay, so what are some concrete things companies can do to encourage ethical behavior and build a culture of integrity?
It starts with having clear and transparent ways to measure success that focus on development and improvement. not just judging individual performance. It's also important to make sure those metrics don't accidentally encourage bad behavior or create loopholes that people can exploit. Companies should reward collaboration, learning, and ethical decision-making. And the culture should be one where ethical behavior is seen as a core part of learning and growing. It takes a multifaceted approach to build a strong ethical foundation.
Okay, last but definitely not least, let's talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. How do mindsets affect DEI efforts in companies?
Mindset plays a surprisingly big role in either helping or hurting DEI initiatives. A lot of it has to do with this thing called stereotype threat. Research shows that people from underrepresented groups, like women in male-dominated fields, tend to trust organizations with fixed mindsets less. They're worried about facing stereotypes about their abilities. So just hiring more diverse people isn't enough. The whole culture needs to shift towards a growth mindset. If it doesn't, a fixed mindset can actually sabotage DEI efforts.
George I's experiences at IDEO are a good example of this.
Yeah. IDEO has a reputation for being innovative and progressive, but I, as a person of color, experienced bullying and exclusion there. It shows that even companies that talk about creativity and inclusion can still have an underlying genius culture that creates inequalities and prevents people from feeling like they belong. Psychological safety is super important for underrepresented groups to feel comfortable and contribute their ideas. So, saying the right words isn't enough. You need a growth mindset for real inclusion.
So it's about changing the whole idea of who's seen as capable and successful. Jayshree Seth from 3M talks about the need to have a wider view of who can thrive in STEM, moving away from that outdated lone genius image.
And Grayston Bakery is a great example of this. They have an open hiring model where they don't do background checks or interviews. They just hire people based on their willingness to learn and grow. It's a growth mindset approach that uncovers hidden talent, especially in communities that are often overlooked, like formerly incarcerated individuals. Focusing on potential can open up opportunities for a much more diverse group of people.
It's fascinating that our own mindset can even affect whether we're drawn to diversity in the first place.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Studies show that when people have a fixed mindset, they tend to prefer things that are familiar and similar. They're less comfortable with different viewpoints. But a growth mindset leads to appreciating the value of diverse perspectives and experiences. This plays out in teams, too. Teams with a growth mindset are better at negotiating because they look for win-win solutions that benefit everyone. So a growth mindset makes you appreciate diversity more.
And people are actively trying to build growth mindsets in education, especially to make things more equitable.
The Equity Accelerator is working with STEM teachers to create cultures of growth in classrooms. They use tools like exam wrappers to help students reflect on their learning process, not just their grades. It's about shifting the focus away from innate ability and towards the power of learning for everyone.
When companies do those cues audits we talked about earlier, it's important to look at them from a DEI perspective too, right?
Absolutely. You have to look at who's in leadership positions and who isn't. How does the company communicate internally? How accessible is the workplace? What kind of humor is used?